All right, I see we've gone live. This is Will Riley, and you are watching the Break It Down show with Pete A. Turner.
That's
Good to be
right.
here.
Hey, we've passed 1,000 episodes around here. What do you think about that?
Woof. I mean, definitely a good milestone. I mean, I think I met you early on in kind of the podcast empire. But yeah, this has been going on for a couple of years now. You've gotten some pretty impressive guests on the show, definitely.
Yeah, well, you included, and you've brought a number of great guests. James Lindsay, Chris Rufo, Sarah Brosh, I think is incredible. You know, these stories that you tell in your books, but also, you've been telling on the Break It Down show and other places. It's interesting. How do you sort out what's interesting to you next? Like right now, I'm going through Hate Crime Hoax again. And boy, the book is just so it causes you create a powerful affect, where I'm like, these stories make me want to do something, write something, explain to people. It's really powerful. How do you pick?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, as a writer and as a teacher in a good, but what's called a comprehensive college, where you're in that next tier down from the top 100, you're expected to research and put out books, but you can kind of choose what they are. I have pretty broad leeway, so I often just write about things that I'm interested in. Like my next book actually has been picked up by Regnery, the large right-leaning publisher I've dropped most of the books with. And it's actually going to be a look at modern American higher education. That's going to be funny and lean a bit right, but also ask some serious questions like, do we need so many people in college? I mean, something like 70% of at least white and African American males go on to a four-year educational institution. Is that sustainable for the future? Like, what percent of those kids actually graduate? But along the way, definitely, I'm going to look at the rise of wokeness on campus. Last I looked from, I believe it was Econ Journal Live, a pretty serious study, 18% of college professors, at least in the social sciences, identify as Marxists or communists. So what's happening with that? What's going on with the grievance studies field, which have been expanding since the 70s? But I mean, also kind of some of those deeper questions from my serious business perspective or serious academic perspective, like, do we need all these college degrees? What's the purpose of college? Who should go to college? Why not join that man's army or go to community college for a lot of these things? Like if you're talking about something like a sales or cosmetology degree, I'm not mocking those, but is spending $200,000 with the University of Wisconsin really the best way to try to gain entry into that field? So that's going to be a pretty big book. I mean, I think it'll be reviewed in academia, but also probably in the popular press and the right-leaning press, so on down the line. So that's the next book. I wrote a book called Alt Wrongs. It's pretty much done looking at the kind of hard right backlash movements. I got some offers on that, but I actually think I'm going to drop that online for free because I'm doing pretty well financially, and I think that that's something a lot of young men should read. You very much right now often have this dialogue between kind of soy boy communists throwing soup cans and then alti guys in their dad's basement on a computer saying the most wicked racial stuff. And I really think that neither of those is an excellent path for a young guy to go down. So I have some, not Jordan B. Peterson-esque necessarily, but some suggestions. What is real? How do you get real knowledge? How do you build what Gad Sad would call cumulative networks of information without becoming a fanatic? So I've got two coming out probably within the next year, barring dramatic failure, becoming an alcoholic or something like that. Are we muted? Oh. Hey, Pete, I think your mic's off.
It was because I got an airplane flying overhead. Yeah, it's one thing to put out a book and make a bunch of money and be successful as a writer, but you're trying to do something bigger. You're trying to inform very Sowellian, the R-rated Thomas Sowell, as you've been called, which is hilarious. I appreciate that you're doing that. We had an interesting guy on the show the other day. His name's John Mosley. He's the coach at East LA Community College and has one of the elite junior college basketball programs in the country. And they're the subject of Netflix's first, like they bought the rights to Last Chance U, and so they're the first show from this new version of it with Netflix. And one of the things he does, just because it's relevant to the story, he's a black guy who went out to college at a high level, played some pro ball, that kind of thing. But he had to turn himself into the person that he is now, and that was through perseverance and hard work. And like any great coach, he takes these guys that, for whatever reason, through some kind of personal calamity or external or internal, whatever, have blown their chance to go to Penn or, get that full ride. And one of the things he does is he believes in these guys and is relentless in his belief and in his ability to push them past what they thought was adversity and into the spot where championship level basketball is played.
Hmm.
These kind of things are this is what young men specifically need in general. I mean, if you're not an elite basketball player, I don't know where you go to get this kind of guidance. But when these guys are quitting on themselves, Coach Mosley's like, "No, I'm not going to quit on you. I'm going to go out and talk to these corporations. I'm going to get you to the next level. I'm going to get you a scholarship. I'm going to introduce you to someone at Microsoft that I know." And he's constantly building this machine that turns undermotivated, under believing in themselves men into these championship level people that almost any business would want to hire, in an instant, just on potential alone.
Yeah, it's a little more difficult when you get outside of sports. I think sports and the military are so often used as examples of, positively integrated male workplaces because they have goals that a lot of men, especially young men, can pretty easily identify with and train for. You're going to prepare to engage the enemy, or you're going to prepare to go out there on the ball field and compete for exactly 48 minutes, this type of thing. It is a little harder to find that kind of coach figure for regular life where you want to become a dentist or something like that. I mean, there aren't a lot of programs where there's someone, screaming at you, but productively about how to extract, lower left bicuspids or something like that. Traditionally, this actually gets into one of my big issues, which is fatherlessness, because traditionally the person that would teach you that would be your dad or someone
Right.
intimately in the community that your father would know, like a priest, hopefully one of the good ones, but, or, local professional where, there'd be a relationship between your family and his or hers. So one of the things actually when it comes to dealing with quote unquote hood kids, and I see this with white Appalachian kids too, is the low baseline, not of intelligence, but of skills.
Mhm.
Like absent varsity training, and the military training is really useful along these same lines, by the way, but absent varsity training, absent a dad, you're not in college yet. It's tough for us to realize as literally grown ass men, but you don't know how to do anything. Like, one of the arguments that really irritates me is this claim by like well-intentioned suburban liberals, like people buy fast food because it's cheap. No, that's not true. Like the last time I went to Chick-fil-A, like a number one was $8.79 or whatever it was. It's a fine sandwich, but that's actually not all that cheap. People are comparing this mentally to Whole Foods or where they might shop as an upper class adult. But I mean, the reality is a 5-pound bag of jasmine rice and a 4-pound bag of beans cost combined like $6. The problem with making that into delicious refried beans and, lime rice and so on is that you have to know how to cook really well to do that. So that skill of cooking needs to be taught. And again, traditionally, who taught you that? Your mom or maybe your father when it came to the grill or meats or something like that. And absent that healthy relationship, who teaches you now? But it's the same with anything else. Like I think we talked about this once before off the air. But when I started looking for jobs, I wanted to work. And actually, I'm a pretty hard worker. I had blue collar jobs throughout high school and college, but I didn't know how to get a job. So I actually just I was on the track team. So I mean, I put on my running shoes and like jogged up the road to the mall and just applied for a bunch of jobs. Like I would just walk in and say, hey, I'm Will Reilly, athlete, local high school student at the local high school. Are you hiring? And because I did that, I mean, I did get some jobs, and they were things like, standing in Foot Locker in the referee outfit, talking to people.
Right.
But I mean, so from that, and I mean, again, you have to be fit enough to move 2 miles to do that. But from there, I learned, someone there told me, like, why didn't you just go in the classified ads? And I found out there are ads in the paper that list like the top 200 jobs in an area. And from there, because this is, I mean, early OOs by this point, I realized that there was the internet and there was Craigslist, I believe it started up, and you could go there and look for jobs and
Right.
so on down the line. But I mean, so there's a huge transition between your job application process being get in the car and let's drive up to the mall and your job to the Long John Silver's or McDonald's or whatever, because they're hiring, but it's going to pay $7 an hour. And you're going to be emptying traps full of fish grease. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But as versus I'm going to go onto Craigslist and Monster and just put up a resume and I'm going to let 25 people a day call me. There's really no racial element to the second one. There might be a little bias in hiring, but not much. There's certainly no age element, whatever. It's just a matter of knowing how to do that. So I think that that's one of the most important things we can teach people, especially young men. Like the guy who's able to do that is going to have 30 times the work opportunities as the guy who's just running down the street with a resume in his hand.
Is there something to the stick to itiveness it takes to do that? I mean, right now you can put in 100 resumes on Monster and not get anywhere because there's 10,000 people applying for the same job. So how do you work on teaching young folks that, hey, first opportunity is you creating it by out knocking, outworking, outrunning, out resumeing, whatever it is, the next person.
Well, I think that obviously ambition or aggressiveness or just an ability to focus and work is pretty important. But again, it's the each additional skill. This is sometimes measured, but I think pretty badly as IQ, because again, your tested IQ reflects how much training you've had in advanced mathematics and so on down the line. But I mean, each level of skill improves your chances of success. So obviously, if you are the most aggressive of the guys that are just jogging down the road to the mall, which I probably was, like you'll get a job and it'll be a non-abusive job in a fun retail environment, but the job will pay $8 an hour. And then if you are able to access, if you can afford to subscribe to the local newspaper or whatever, and you can access the top 200 jobs in your area, again, aggression will predict how many of those you apply to, but there's a cap of 200. And then if you go into, the internet world, and sure, it's slow and boring, but you apply for 20,000 jobs, you have a much better chance, again, at almost an order of magnitude higher of landing a good one. So this, again, is one of the things that I say all the time, which is sort of be multivariate as an adult person. It's good to be aggressive, but it's also good to be trained. It's also good to be smart. And none of those things by itself predicts 100% of where you're going to end up in life. So I think that's the point. But the more skills you have, or the more virtues, for want of a better word, you have to bring to the table, I mean, probably the better you're going to do as a person.
One of the things we've kind of talked about on the show, and we've sort of bounced around the topic here, is this. We had Dan Crenshaw on the show. You joined me with that show. That was great, and he talks about this victim status that people seem to aspire to. And I would say that you need an antonym for aspire, because you're sort of devaluing yourself. And one of the things I love to say, and I've put it on Facebook a couple times, because it's it's a dilemma for the left. But I believe in black people. I believe in people in general that can go out and they can outwork their problems. So in the military and on sports, football, and those kind of things, you have to play up to a standard. You don't want to let anybody else down. You're pushing yourself to be a better player. I mean, Michael Jordan is considered even better than he was because he elevated his team. Dan Marino did this. He'd look at a guy and be like, he would telekinetically, go, hey, I'm going to throw you this ball, right? And so all of these things require an uplifting. We always talk about all boats, rise at the tide. And if we're all aspiring to be a better person, if we're all aspiring to not let each other down, isn't that who wants to be a victim in this case? Like, who wants to be? Yeah, I got really into Laura Ingalls Wilder's writing, and I was reading, everything, like the things that she wrote, the things that wrote about her, and this libertarian idea that she has. Yeah, and yet there's some government help in there. But here is a lady who had to make it on her own. Her mom and her family had to make it on their own. They had to go out and do the vast majority of the work. What makes this victim status? This I want to turn myself into this micro group so that you guys can appreciate how hard it is for me. What makes that palatable for people?
Well, I think that there are different, just as, I mean, the old joke is in high school, they're jocks and nerds and quote unquote freaks and so on. I think there are different groups in society that have different kind of hierarchies in terms of what they value. So we're talking about competitive, mostly males in kind of the business world. Like, how do you get the best job in sales? How would you do in the army? How do athletics play into this and so on? And I don't think in any of those worlds being a victim is especially highly praised. I don't think you see a lot of hate crime hoaxes in the U.S. Marines, for example, because I don't really think it would be taken all that seriously if someone said, I was beaten up because of my ethnicity and was unable to effectively defend myself, and I have no way to identify who did it. I don't necessarily think that would be a good way to move up in rank or to avoid teasing or something like that. So, I mean, I'm sure there are serious sexual assaults and so on that are reported in that environment. but victimization itself doesn't have cachet. But there are other sectors of society, like modern higher education, where there very definitely is an advantage that attaches to being a victim. And I mean, this gets into some of the stuff we've talked about before. I mean, where we've discussed, we had a whole episode once on Dr. Kendi's books, if I recall correctly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And his argument is that any failure, like any gap between groups where one group underperforms, has to be due to racial prejudice, essentially. The only other option is some kind of genetic inferiority that we don't even want to discuss. And something that comes out of that I don't think a lot of people automatically understand is that this means it's good to be losing to some extent. If you are on the losing side of a gap in performance between two groups, you must be being oppressed. And the logical flip side of that is that if you're doing well, you must, to some extent, be the oppressor. This is what, by the way, what makes it so weird and ambiguous when you see well-intentioned left-wing people talk about Jews and Asians, because it's obvious on one hand that these are victimized minorities. I mean, we love our Jewish and Asian countrymen, but they lead the nation in hate crimes annually. They're these small, successful minorities that everyone picks for robberies. It's obvious they're suffering a great deal. But on the other hand, they're rich. So if you accept the Kendi formulation, that means that they must somehow be oppressing someone. Who are they oppressing? You know, the African-American guys they live in the same hood neighborhood with? It doesn't make sense, but it has to be if you're a religious believer in this stuff. So one of the things you've seen is people in this environment where victimization, i.e. having a cherished defeated status, is a source of power, falsely claiming victimization. One of the wildest things that I learned writing Hate Crime Hoax, and I think that most other people that look at this, I mean, there's an entire website, www.fakehatecrimes.org, completely different set of cases from my own. I mean, not every single one, but an entirely different data set. But I mean, if you look at their work or at mine, one of the things you find is that almost half the cases on the website originate on a college or senior high school campus or grad school campus, something like that. So a huge majority of them come out of this hyper woke student environment. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And this ties into a lot of other phenomena. Like when you look at the number of kids identifying, not even just as trans, but as something like non-binary demi-queer, or the number of people advocating, for example, for being overweight as kind of a condition of oppression, that fat rights movement, this is an entire field of academic study now, more than 9 departments, I believe. You know, all this stuff, like the identification of mental illness to the point where traditionally considered fairly mild conditions like ADHD are in Twitter bios and so on. There has to be, to some extent, an element of people saying, well, I'm not just a well-adjusted middle-class white person from Cleveland. I, too, have some kind of oppressed victim identity. And I don't even hate on these people this much. There's an element of protective coloration to that, right? Like if you're on a college campus where regularly at a major seminar, someone will say, we're going to let all these students of color and people with a non-normative identity speak first, you can either sit and wait your turn for 2 hours, or you can say, well, you know, as a demi-queer, overweight, bisexual, Jewish woman, I too can speak. And so I do think there are whole sectors of society where you see people focusing on how hurt they are or how defeated they are rather than how victorious they are, because that is a source of power. And this ties even into history. I mean, the people that would traditionally have been considered glorious conquerors, like we assume that all humans are, you know, fairly bad and predatory to a roughly equal degree until pretty recently, following the era of genuine racism. But I mean, so there's traditionally been some respect for people, you know, Pizarro, Genghis Khan, whatever, whether this is justified or not, who are able to fight well, beat other warriors, and dominate large areas of society. So now that that has fallen out of fashion, you see instead perhaps people idealizing the opposite, who can be the softest, the kindest, the most hurt person. And again, that's something that goes on in a world very different from the world in a barracks, but it's a world that exists.
We have shades of this thing though in the military. I mean, just for example, the push-up is a common measure of performance, and we have a minimum standard and we have a maximum standard, and then we have like this above the standard scale, right? So you can, you know, if you're and a lot of people struggle to meet the minimum requirement, which is nothing that recognizes any kind of like special fitness. This is just a very common person that can literally push themselves off of the ground 30 times. They can run 2 miles in something other than, like nothing greater than 10 minutes a mile. I forget what the standard is. It is not challenging. And then you got like folks like myself, like I always wanted to be peak at my physical fitness. So I always wanted to score off the scale in as many events as possible. And anybody, I mean, literally anybody can train their body to improve wherever they are to get to the minimum standard for sure, but potentially quite a bit higher. I mean, if you just do more push-ups, if you just spend 4 times a day doing push-ups until you just fail at being able to do them anymore, you will, over the course of them. I mean, their muscles, they just get stronger. They just get more used to it. You get used to the pain. It's funny because you can take that and take your career a lot more into your own hands. And so if someone sees you dramatically improve your PT score, or you show up with, I remember when I was in the operations office, I would have a hidden list of all the PT scores. And whenever I saw mine, I wouldn't know it was mine unless I happen to remember my scores. I'd be like, holy shit, who's that badass? Right. And because they're badass scores. And I'm not the only guy in this entire battalion, but I'm looking and I'm measuring like these guys are all fast. They're doing a lot of push-ups. These are people, and we all do this. We recognize this. If you want to go to SF or you want to go to Ranger School, the first thing you do is a physical fitness test. So if you want to get on to a good team, if you want to get picked up by good commanders, like I need this guy, it's not the person who's easily defeatable, because it turns out in the military, being defeatable is in no way a thing that you want. We can put a lot of people to work. Your weakest link is still your person that you're trying to get a hold of, but that ability to build a team that can compete at the highest level and be combat effective is critical, and it's based upon, among the things, can you shoot and can you run? Those are the things.
Yeah, sorry, I turned off the cam for a second. Jane just walked behind me. But essentially, so I mean, there are a couple of different things there. So I mean, I actually agree with you. Like I was curious about whether I'd be good enough as an athlete to compete in college, for example, when I was in high school. So I would certainly do things like look at how my ability to run the mile or something like that matched up with other people in our district. I mean, I was in, and I wouldn't have been good enough for anything but like D2 or something like that. But I mean, our conference was the Upstate 8, so you could keep track of all the boys or all the men in the conference pretty easily. Again, this is like the early age of computers. People did that. So yeah, obviously that's traditionally been the thing that people who are competitive do. Like if you're on a sales floor, when I was doing that in Chicago, we would literally put everyone's sales up on a big board for Marcus Evans or any kind of serious trading floor environment. And it gets pretty competitive. Like you don't want to not be on the board, or you don't want to be, if the top 10 guys out of 40 are ranked, you don't want to be the guy who's listed number 10 about to fall off. Right. Obviously. So that's the traditional way to gain status. But I also think, I mean, there are different ways to gain status. Like, have you ever heard the term sneaky fucker strategy?
No, I haven't. Tell me what that is.
I got this from my man Gad Sad, one of the country's top social scientists. But the sneaky fucker strategy is an evolutionary strategy. So, like, traditionally, most males have tried to be, among humans, among similar predator mammal species, have tried to be basically good performers to attract women. So humans have generally wanted to be the best warrior, the best athlete. Maybe if you were a little less physically fit, you'd want to be the best breadwinner. You'd be like the merchant, the Phoenician merchant or something like that. And if you were just in that second tier, you'd be dangerous enough that everyone in the first tier would respect you, and you'd pursue women in that solid second tier. There are a lot of jokes about this in male dating, like I'm going for the 6s and 7s tonight, that kind of thing. So they're traditionally, you would be a performance-based mating strategy. But biologists have noted in recent years that among a number of different ape and predator species, there's another way of getting laid, which is essentially to trick people. To, like orangutans, for example, are notorious rapists, which we don't need to get into. But more often, for example, there are species where males can mimic females and essentially sneak off with the female once or twice a week and then produce children, which the alpha male will raise as his. This can go, like, male feminists, justified or not, are sometimes accused of this in our society, where the mating strategy is getting close to women that have been offended by men who are too aggressive and masculine, or that perhaps have been dumped, and sleeping with them repeatedly and then trying to initiate a relationship. So I think that to some extent we're seeing a sneaky fucker strategy when it comes to obtaining power with a lot of this woke stuff. So if you have to compete to obtain power, if the people that get into college are the people with the highest SAT scores, who would all be Asian or Jewish, cough. I mean, great respect for those people, but in fact, the white and black guys arguing about this would not be in the top 1,000. But if the people that get into Harvard are just the people with the best SAT scores in the country, then everyone has to compete to get the best SAT score in the country. There's no other practical, logical way of getting into Harvard.
Right.
But the SF alternative, let's call it, is to use some kind of woke opt-out from the competition instead. So then you have a sideline of people competing to perform the highest on the woke opt-out. So if you can convince Harvard that because of the terrible oppression that being a bisexual woman involves, Jane, you're free to walk past, by the way, if you want to. But if you can convince Harvard that the terrible oppression of being a bisexual woman is so awful that you deserve 200 additional points on the boards when those are calculated, you've just gained an advantage that would require thousands, probably tens of thousands of hours of study. So in a sense, you've competed very well, quote unquote, evolutionarily. You've found an alternative trapdoor around the normal competition. The equivalent would be, I was in a road race once that was just wildly sketchy. This was in Chicago. I think it was on the south side of Chicago. I don't know how we ended up competing, but like a couple guys from my team signed up. And after the race, we were all sitting around in like a park talking, flirting. And one of the guys who'd finished pretty high up in the race just said, to be honest, I got into a car after the first mile and just drove, set whatever number of the miles, got out and went back on the race course because I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of my girl, but I also didn't want to run 10 miles. And I mean, those kind of cuts exist everywhere in life. It's just been considered traditionally dishonorable to take them. But if you're willing to take them, and if that's socially accepted, I mean, I'm kind of rambling here, but you then get people competing for this alternative form of status. Who has the level of victimization sufficient to knock off the most points on the test?
Right. I'm thinking about, there's a lot of questions I have based off of this part of the conversation. And I think it's important to also note that, again, if you're defeatable, I mean, like a warlord is just a person who just decided to take complete control of their life, right? And so if you're defeatable, I'm either going to enlist you into my warlord status thing, or I'm going to kill you. I mean, that's it. I mean, I'm going to be cut and dry because I'm trying to control things. And it's really tough to survive. Sure, there's always been a sneaky fucker, but there can't be too many in a tribe, because it just isn't going to work out, because the alphas are going to sort out the weak and marginalize or ostracize or some other kind of eyes them. When we look at these things, are we that much removed from a time 10,000 years ago when yeah, a sneaky fucker, maybe even two sneaky fuckers, but after that, it's going to be dangerous to be a sneaky fucker. I mean, you look at them. I'm watching this great thing on Netflix now about this art heist in Boston, and there's a whole bunch of mob guys involved. They all keep ending up with their heads cut off in a ditch or in the trunk of their own car and all these kind of things, right? This is this thing where if someone chooses to come along and impose their dominance on you because you're defeatable, then it's really hard to survive and make it in a way that makes any kind of comfortable sense, I guess I would say.
Sure. I mean, I think to some extent that's true, but I also think that people that live by the sword tend to underestimate the power of people that live by the pen. So, I mean, there are definitely still arenas in society, agriculture, the competitive military, religion, industries versus business, so on, as sports, that are dominated by pretty traditional, aggressive kind of paradigms of behavior, which I think is usually pretty healthy. But I think that the way that those who prioritize kind of alternate means of competition regulate that is that they in general are more likely to try to control kind of the means of expression, what you could call discourse. So if you look at academia, for example, I mentioned the major recent study that found that 18% of professors identify as Marxists. Another like 25% identified as radicals, and like 20%, these are all different categories, identified as activists. So people that believe that our society is in some way deeply screwed up, and that don't maybe like face-to-face physical competition and fighting, very often move into arenas where, for example, you can teach other people's kids how to believe and how to behave. Um, you've got the mass media and tech, which are almost entirely dominated by fun but nerdy kind of tier two bros, would be a good way to put it, that have some SF characteristics. And again, if someone's talking that you don't like, if you look at a lot of things that have recently happened, you can just remove them. I mean, so like yesterday on Twitter, there was James O'Keefe, who's the founder of Project Veritas, and who is, like him or not, a bro, a funny guy, has been doing this entire set of penetrations, no pun intended, of mainstream media, where like he sent his guys into CNN to apply as interns or whatever, and they recorded these incredible interviews from like top 50 people in CNN saying things like climate change is going to be our new made-up COVID crisis. Not, of course, that COVID was entirely made up. Well, it certainly was exaggerated originally. But I mean, that's a quote. Matt Getz, we're going to try to get him. We're going to run every negative story on him because he's a prominent, fairly high ranking, very conservative Republican. I mean, this is all on video. You can find it easily online just by Googling Project Veritas. So, like, the next day, O'Keefe is entirely removed from Twitter. It's the rare permanent ban. And like, you've been in the military, I've been in big business. Like, we know what this is. They're slapping the guy down. He's lost rank. You know, it's obvious what happened. But the excuse given was he had an alt account. Like, apparently there were different accounts for Project Veritas that you could track to one IP. And again, that doesn't even mean anything. Were they using Hootsuite? Did they have like a router in a shared house? It's just meaningless nonsense, in my opinion. Yeah. But he's completely gone. So if some funny ex-athlete exposes your network as a bunch of hacks, do they ever get to talk again? It's not cutting off at his head, but it's definitely sewing his mouth shut, you know, if you want to put that in, you know, classic competitive terms. You know, another sector would be the NGO sector, where if you want money, if you're in higher education, if you're in much of business, if you want a grant, again, the people that control those money flows tend to be very much on that political left and very much in that urban, lower upper class, again, kind of SFE category of persons. So I think what you see is the nerd jock competition probably goes back to the merchants versus the soldiers in Sparta. There's nothing wrong with it inherently. But this is the format of it that you see today, where the jock types, the athletes and industrialists and so on, have risen to never before expected levels of money and prominence. But the people that would perhaps prefer a different strategy of life now control the tools that let you talk. So it's interesting. And I mean, people say these things like, well, I don't care, I'll just go to Gab, you know, but there's a major difference. Like, people that have been deplatformed by these kind of sneaky little guys, frankly, Donald Trump, Milo Yiannopoulos, whatever you might think of him, you know, Louis Farrakhan, for that matter, on the black guy side, the original Libertarian Party page, those guys are just gone. I mean, like, Donald Trump is no longer a frequent news headline because Donald Trump is no longer on Twitter.
Yeah, or Facebook. That's also, I'm no longer on Twitter. I'm not officially banned, but I made a joke about Zachary Taylor back when someone, I forget who the congressperson was, but when she tried to drop files or papers of impeachment on Joe Biden, and I'm like, this has just got to stop. You know, if you get, next thing you know, someone's going to come after Zachary Taylor, and he's gonna, punch you in the mouth by proxy. This Zachary Taylor getting impeached would cause one of his minions to go out and punch him in the mouth. Apparently, that was inciting violence, even though Zachary Taylor's been dead since 1850. And so I appealed this and said, this is clearly a joke. And then they said, no, it wasn't. You can appeal. So I appealed again. And then I've just been stuck in this spin cycle. You know, and I ultimately don't care. It's Twitter. Who cares about that? But you're right. Like, here's something where there's all kinds of comedians that have said way more dangerous things. There's been journalists that have said demonstratively dangerous, insightful, horrible things about races of people and everything. And they're encouraged to be on there. And I guess also I read an interesting paper or article today in the New York Times, and all of these institutions have compromised their integrity so completely that I go into this reading like okay, what is this going to be? And it's by Andrea Williams, and she talks. It's called "We Have No Right to Destroy Them," and it talks about the emergence of Jackie Robinson as a major league player and how the major league teams went in and just basically turned all of these black players who wanted to come, turn them into free agents. It's the first form of free agency. But you could also turn that around and say all of the Negro League teams that were in the business of making money with black players also didn't and weren't able to make an agreement with the major leagues. And so you're holding a group of people to a standard that no business would take. Like if IBM recognized a pocket of 1,000 people who would dramatically improve their team, their product, and they have no agreement other than to make one with the person that they want to hire, why would they go to somebody else and make it more expensive for them? Like, there's no business that would do that. But we hold these impossible standards on people that are dead, and we don't get anywhere with this, right? So we have this mess of canceling people, doxing people. There's all kinds of things on the internet where it's like, what's his race? Because they want to assign you a belief system and everything. And it's like, stop doing these things and ask Will what he's about. Ask Pete what he's about, because I'm going to tell you, I believe in you. I believe in your ability to outwork problems. In the U.S., you can be severely autistic and still be marketable for the right kind of job. That's not common in the world. That's not common at all. So we have to figure these things out. Will popped out, so I'm going to freestyle here for a second. If you're watching the show, we have new shirts out, by the way, and you see that streaming across the bottom of the screen. And they are new shirts. I think you'll like them. If you want them in general, you can go to breakitdownshow.com and you can grab those shirts. Make sure that also there are the links for Will's books. There's Hate Crime Hoax, which I'm reading again right now, which rocketed to the top of the Amazon charts. Congratulations. Welcome back, Will. And then also his Taboo 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, which is another fantastic book. You can get those things. And in general, go to the PayPal link. I'll put that link in here right now. If you're watching on the video side, there it is. But also, if you're on the podcast side, just look in every episode. There's a link there. And you can put, $5, $10, $20 a month into my pocket. Help me support the show. It's sort of like my own private Patreon, except for I don't have to pay Patreon as much. And Patreon's not going to put somebody else's product in front of mine. So if you want to, it's like, let's cut the middleman out. Let's disintermediate Patreon and just help Pete by going to the PayPal link there. I was going into the whole thing about the the New York Times article about the Negro leagues and how they bled talent into the majors because there was no business agreement. And whether that was right or wrong, there was no business agreement. These are businesses. They didn't have the foresight to have a contract. They weren't able to take people to court, and players who were at a lower level were able to play at a higher level. These things, the silencing of people, it seems like being disingenuous is the left's business, and it's hard to take them serious when terms are constantly being redone. I can't believe that Kindy's work can get through peer review. There's no way you can replicate this work reliably without running, a number of statistical analysis common tools. I just don't understand how we get away with all of these things in society.
Yeah, well, a couple things. First of all, very little of Kindy's work goes through peer review, I would speculate. I wrote a book that was much more methodologically focused, and except for the hate crime hoax graphic itself, which I discussed with the National Association of Scholars for a pretty major piece, that wasn't peer reviewed, but I can't imagine that Kindy's for a pure popular press would be. And that's kind of the get around with a lot of this stuff. And again, one of my goals over the next couple of years, next 2 years, is writing 4 or 5 very serious journal articles, just so I can't get hit with this same barb of like, oh, Reilly's pretty smart, but why doesn't he take that to the conferences? First of all, I do, but that's a legitimate argument on both sides of the debate. So okay, I'll do this to show I'm pretty good still. But Kindy's sociology, from all I've heard, is pretty solid. But the stuff like the only cause of a gap is racism, that I guarantee you that's never been to like the ASA annual conference. So that's the short answer there. But yeah, when it comes to the redefinition of words, I think this is a major problem. I think politicians on all sides engage in this, but I think it's been a characteristic of the left going back almost to Foucault and Marcuse. And we've seen some just wildly ridiculous examples lately, like when it came to court packing the other day. So the Democrats openly want to pack the Supreme Court.
Right.
There's legislation being proposed that would change the number of justices on the court from 9 to 13. And this is incredibly, incredibly consequential because the Democrats control the Congress. And technically speaking, they control the Senate. The only hope is that Joe Manchin or maybe Kamala Harris won't do something absolutely crazy. But again, that relies on the Democrats not being able to bring one Republican around, you know. But that's something that's actually being considered right now formally at the level of legislation. And when they were confronted about this, Jerry Nadler gave a press conference and he said, no, we're not packing the court. We're unpacking the court, which is packed by President Trump. And what they're trying to do is confuse successfully winning a Supreme Court nomination and appointment session, i.e. Brett Kavanaugh, where there was some contestation, where he was accused of sexual harassment and this sort of thing. They're trying to confuse that mildly sketchy loading of the 9-member court with actually increasing the size of the court, which is what court packing has always, always meant. It's never meant anything else. So that's a classic example of this kind of verbal redefinition. I mean, another example of this comes up in the transgender debate, where you're now seeing people say they want to ban conversion therapy. And the first time I heard this, you know, I thought, well, I must be against that as well. I mean, whether or not you think everyone that identifies as trans has gender dysphoria, we don't want trans people forced to dress like men or something like that if they identify as women. But that's not what it means. What conversion therapy means is that you do not favor giving chemical castrators to young children so that they don't experience puberty. So like the absence of conversion, the opposite of conversion therapy is giving your kid barely legal drugs so that they never go through puberty. That's what's supposed to be good. And this kind of wordplay occurs at a level deep enough that most people don't even recognize it. Most people simply say, well, yes, I am against conversion therapy. Most people simply say, yes, I am against court packing, and they have no idea what's meant by this nonsense. So yeah, I mean, this is a major political strategy, and it occurs definitely on the left. And yeah, a lot of the ideas that really support it, I mean, at the level of the major published books and so on, probably haven't gone through extensive peer review. I mean, you could say, you know, no more than, you know, a Jason Reilly column has or something like that on the right. But the difference is that I don't think that Jason Reilly or someone in that position is presenting this as undisputed science. Whereas a lot of this stuff that comes out of like the Journal of Qualitative Fat Studies or something is then held up as the science without the average person necessarily understanding, well, there's a big difference between the science as in physics and the science as in this is my qualitative conclusion to a paper with one quantitative table in it about what gender means. So some differences.
Yeah. And, you know, when you go through that peer review, you're looking at, as a scholar, someone licensed to do research, you're looking for the boilerplated regression models and, you know, all of the tools that you would use. You know, we tend to want to make really complex problems into single variant problems. We've talked about multivariate problems before here on the show a lot with you and with other people. But when you have something that's written in there is one table or whatever it is, again, how does this get to review? How does someone allow this kind of baloney to get through? Like, okay, if that's true, then I should be able to go out and find that. And I'm not going to find it because you've not applied rigor professionally. So do these, I mean, but yet people get peer reviewed published through these things. It's maddening to see this happening. Is the standard that low now that you can, I mean, obviously, you know, James and his crew, they got a bunch of things through, James Lindsay, that were ridiculous on his face, you know, translating Mein Kampf and all that kind of thing. But is there any pulling out of this dive, Will?
No, I mean, so, well, I think so. I actually think that after the James Lindsay thing, so actions have consequences. And I encourage people on kind of that sane center right to keep making points that obviously are true, because it's hard to deny something that obviously is true. Men and women both exist and that kind of thing. You know, actually, I don't want to get into the trans question. I mean, gender is different from sex to the extent that gender is recognized as a definable concept. But the males and females certainly exist. No one really disputes that. I mean, that's sort of an obvious point. And when people say that sort of thing, I think that most people listen to it and automatically say, well, that's true. And so radical ideas are pushed back to, you know, try again another day. So I definitely do think there are some pulls out of the dip here. But yeah, when you talk about academic peer review, first, as I started my comment by saying, I think that the James Lindsay kind of so-called hoax part 2 really showed a lot of people that are smart laymen kind of what that means. Because there's a tendency in the USA where we beat the Germans and then the Russians, we're competing with the Chinese using science to kind of reify science. Like, oh, a psychologist said that. I mean, to an extent where you saw every professional woman in your life putting their entire title in their Twitter and Facebook bio after Joe Biden got lightly made fun of. But I mean, James Lindsay and those guys applied to a bunch of top 50 journals and got papers accepted that were just completely ridiculous. The most ridiculous one to me actually was the one that advocated for fat bodybuilding, where they said that to be a bodybuilder, you don't have to be fit. There's no real reason you couldn't be incredibly strong, but also 200 pounds overweight, eating whatever you wanted. And I mean, that was, I believe it was a Journal of Fat Studies. I mean, a major national journal accepted it. There was another one where they said that the best cure for male homophobia was anal sex. Or I guess technically it was toy play, but they said that men who engage in regular anal play are less homophobic than those that don't, which isn't even a crazy idea. But then they didn't sort of recommend, they said that a good way to cure homophobia would be anal sex for homophobic guys, if I recall the paper correctly. I don't know how you're going to get them to agree to that. But I mean, this again, top a major well-known journal. There was the one about dog parks where they said that the question that's sometimes jokingly asked about it is the doggy position feminist for animals? But where they pretended to look at the difference in reaction to dogs being humped by males versus female dogs, or is the owner male or female? And they had this obviously fake data set in there. I mean, so when people saw all of this, I do think they began to question some of what's going on. The short answer as RePeer review is that peer review is generally journal by journal. So if you are applying to the top journal in physics or even political science, you're going to be very harshly peer reviewed. If you are applying to a journal, and I'm making this up, with a name like Black Radical Feminist Qualitative Philosophy, the people that are friendly with that journal and that are in its pool of agreed editors are going to be the people that review you. So it might be much, much more difficult to get a mainstream conservative piece published there than to get complete nonsense published there. And I assume, without critiquing journals out of field too harshly, I assume that's what happened at like Hypatia and all these journals that James Lindsay submitted to. One of the things people forget is that ideology makes scholarly fields really, really unreliable. Like, this actually is an almost mathematical, almost scientific point. So generally, what you call policy preferences match partisan preferences. So if you're looking at ways to solve poverty, there are 8 or 9 major ideas that go from the conservative to the liberal end of the spectrum. Where on the right, you have charter schools and enterprise zones, which we know work pretty well. And on the left, you have UBI, which we know works okay. I mean, you have 8 or 9 positions across that spectrum. Maybe in the middle, you'd have something like a civilian conservation corps, mandatory military service for people. But all of them are not stupid. All of them match party idea or party identification. The problem with fields like sociology, where 97% of people are on the radical left, is that 97% of people can agree with the radical left like policy preference that's rejected by almost everyone in mainstream society. So if you just interviewed 100 people with a bachelor's degree or more, IQ over 120, and you asked them, how would you deal with transgenderism in kids, for example? I would say the large majority of them would probably advocate what's called watchful waiting, like don't abuse them, never tolerate bullying, but see what happens, take them to a therapist. If almost everyone in your field is a fringe radical, though, it's very easy to get around to the fringe radical position, which is transition now in many cases, being the dominant, being the heavily majority position. And this is why things like affirmative action, abortion in month 9, which is pretty close to being murder, if we're speaking frankly. I mean, a lot of this stuff, massive gun control, is almost universally preferred if you look at studies of newsrooms, if you look at studies of academics, so on, because everyone has the same ideas. And I'm actually not even coming at this from a hard right perspective, because I'm not hard right. This would be the same thing if everyone in these businesses actually was, quote unquote, a Nazi, an alt-right, Pepe the Frog profile picked, young son of a bitch. I mean, you'd get the same sort of radical extremism or worse. But that's not the issue we're dealing with now. What we're dealing with now is that the people in the popular press newsrooms are, 93% liberal and left-leaning moderate. So that's going to get you a different set of biases.
What has happened that actually, I want to ask you a question about race, because it's such a confounding thing. One of the questions I love to ask Black guests, I don't always ask it because it's a hard question, is what does the Black community owe itself? And they struggle, either one, to have a good answer for this, because it is a very hard question, but it's a fair question. And then, or they say, "Oh, I ain't answering that here. Like that will cause me a lot of problems." If we really care about race, if we really want to improve the condition of Black folks in the United States, I mean, they're the most likely to be murdered by people who look like them. And I'm not trying to be racist. I'm just, referencing the numbers here. You look at how many Black men are murdered in this nation. It's greater than the number of veterans that kill themselves, and we're desperate to solve that problem. Why aren't we desperate to solve these problems? Why does the Black community struggle to reckon with what it owes itself as a community? Why is that such a hard thing to bring up? Because I believe in our ability to solve our problems, but if we're afraid to even discuss it, if we're afraid to even hold ourselves accountable, how in the world are we going to solve these things?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, so what does the Black community owe itself? I mean, I think the same kind of normal, life affirming behavior that members of every community owe to one another. First of all, I'm libertarian enough to think that you don't owe anyone else anything but non-aggression. I mean, when people who appear to personally and politically dislike me say things like, "You should give me half your money because it's moral," I mean, my default response is kind of laughter. Like, I don't really identify with that at all. Right. So what do I owe everyone in the country who happens to be Black? I mean, that comes down to the same sort of thing of non-aggression, friendship, if we like one another. But in terms of what actually, in terms of the sense in which you meant that, what ideas or policies would help the Black community move forward? I think that to a certain extent, there are these same common sense ideas and policies that would help the poor white community or recent immigrants or whatever move forward. I think that in general, the lower the crime is in an area, the easier it is for people to live there. And I mean, there are obvious things like more diverse police officers, i.e. like more officers, but a diverse range of them in Black areas that reduce crime. I think that the better you perform in educational environments, the more likely you are to be successful as a group. And again, there are things there like the development of study culture, which has been a problem for Black people and for Southern whites, by the way, through the charter schools that have been really, really successful at fixing that problem in Black communities. So I don't think there's anything that's unique to Black people who are now average Black household, which is generally one person and maybe a kid, income over $45,000 per year. I mean, I don't think that most Black people are desperately struggling, but looking at the issues that exist like crime, fatherlessness, and academic struggles, and taking real steps to fix those is what the Black community owes itself. I think right now the racism conversation is almost a distraction. So there are two different things going on at once. One, racism exists, but two, it doesn't have much to do with most modern problems. So if you talk to an intelligent sociologist like my guy Rod Graham online, or any of the people he goes back and forth with on Twitter and other social media, and even some of my buddies, Angel Eduardo, Javier Bonilla, I mean, one thing that you'll normally hear is, well, look, we still do the audit studies, and we find that 8% of people or whatever it is express racist attitudes. So, for example, you are slightly but definitely less likely to get a call back if you have a Black name on your resume than if you have a white name. The study I usually cite as a political scientist is that they did a really good version of the work for, vote for question over at, I think, Pew Research recently. And they found that 8% of people, fully 8%, wouldn't vote for a Black person for president, with all these caveats, like they're wildly qualified, they're a member of your political party, like just a measure of pure racism. And it's an easy step from taking that to, as Ibram Kendi does, saying, well, that obviously explains all the gaps we're seeing. Let's work on fixing racism, and then we'll talk to you about everything else. But everything else won't exist because racism will be fixed. The problem with this, though, is that if you look deeper, it doesn't make a ton of sense. At least in the modern era and for the past 40 years, the same level of racism is existing against a bunch of other groups. So in that same sort of vote for question study, widely known major poll, we found that 9% of people wouldn't vote for a Jew or a Hispanic. I believe it was 7% for a woman. And then you got into real prejudice that still exists. It was, I think, 19% for a Mormon, 21% for a gay guy, 40% for a Muslim. And the problem with this is that many of these groups, like Jews and Muslims, are the richest in the country. Hispanics face the same amount of money, bigotry as blacks, but actually earn pretty dramatically less money, at least at the individual level. And there's obviously a variable that comes into that, language fluency. So just looking at racism and saying this explains everything is really pretty non-productive. When you look at those major black problems I cited, like fatherlessness, crime, and academic struggles, it's really notable that most of those are pretty recent. So certainly once you adjust for class, certainly in the 1950s, I don't think you would have seen a dramatic difference between working class whites and blacks, whites and say Appalachia and blacks on some of those metrics. But I mean, and Walter Williams has pointed out, around the time of World War II, the black fatherlessness rate was about 10%. Whites were doing even better. That was like 4%, but that's not really the point. Today, the rate is, if I have this correct, 72% for African Americans, almost 40% for whites. So saying that ethnic conflict, which is dramatically decreased for whites and blacks, or racism, which has decreased about 90% for black people, is responsible for this is pretty silly. I, in general, advise just identifying the problem itself as we would in business or the military and solving the problem. Okay, there aren't a lot of fathers around. Can we actually start enforcing the child support laws, which we know will bring fathers back into the picture? What can we do to cut back welfare? The question of why there aren't fathers around and to what extent white and black people fighting 100 years ago had to do with that. So I don't really, and this could be a personality flaw, see that as important at all.
When we look at these problems, veteran suicide is always a good example. One is too many, and that gets into the territory of the war on suicide. And we never know what the final point is how much racism can you actually boil out before you get to an impossible, chaos focused number. I mean, you look at how many police patrols there are in the nation and how many deaths, and the number of deaths. Look, they're all tragedies, but I would bet that, I don't know the numbers on this, the number of people significantly injured or killed by a falling tree or a tree limb is comparable to the number of people that are shot and killed by the police. And of those people that are shot and killed by the police, we know this, that some of these people are suicide by cop, they're deeply mentally impaired, or they're just, in a position where everybody can go, yeah, that guy needed to die. I mean, there are times when that happens. So we have this desire to have these perfect outcomes, but that's just not reality. I mean, the craziest things happen. That's why there's that chaos level. So is there a rule of thumb for things like this where police violence or anything, where racism can, like, you can say, like, we know when unemployment, like anything below this level, and we're kind of not worried about unemployment anymore because folks are working. What's that? Give us a sense for that, Will, if you can.
I mean, I think we're pretty close to the default level of let's move on to the next when it comes to a lot of these issues. Like, I don't know about racism. We'll talk about that in a second. By the way, a shout to Brad Hutchings in the comments who said something like, stop making excuses. Let's develop robot fathers. That's pretty funny. The interesting thing is we don't yet know how some of these things will work in 100 years. I mean, I don't see any reason that gene splicing technology couldn't make humans more or less aggressive, or make young mothers more or less likely to take care of their kids, for example. I mean, I would have no problem using those technologies to promote the traditional human virtues, for example. Robots are a bit iffier, but I mean, couldn't you have something called like the CradleBot 1206 that would monitor, I mean, but nothing crazy, but they would monitor like the glucose levels in a baby's bloodstream, so when the kid is sick, so when the kid is eating a poor enough diet that'll affect IQ. I don't really see any reason we couldn't do those things. We might find in the end that there are some tiny residual class and race and regional differences when it comes to things like, tested math intelligence. I personally don't think we will to any real extent when it comes to race. But even if we do, I mean, I certainly think that the things we can do to equalize diet and so on in the next 100 years will make a lot of this seem just primitive to us today. Like, you mean they used to feed their kids sugar water and leave them alone in front of radioactive boxes? It's like the old Irish midwives that would dip a piece of cloth in bourbon and just stick it in the kid's mouth. And now we're just sort of like, that's why they made all those drunks, huh? It's horrible. I think we'll be seen in very much the same way with our 70% father absent rate and our, kids raised by Nickelodeon and so on. And this is across all groups. But I mean, Anyway, I think when we talk about a lot of these issues like cop shooting, we're pretty close to the default position of good performance right now. I mean, there are at minimum 35 million police patrols that involve a stop in a typical year in the USA. That's probably closer to 60 million stops, by the way. I see that the figure I often use was identified by someone in law enforcement patrols with a stop, so you can have two stops. But I mean, out of that number, minimum 40 million stops, there were a total of 18 unarmed black people killed by police last year. And I don't see why we need to racialize this. There was a total of a bit under 100 people, huge white and Hispanic majority. Poor whites, actually, maybe the people most likely to get shot, as Friars pointed out. But I mean, a total of about 100 men shot by police, unarmed, probably genuinely troubling cases. Now, I personally think all 50 or whatever cops involved in that should at least face a trial, should at least be, in most cases, probably fired as officers. No reason if you can fight well enough, there's no reason to shoot an unarmed man 18 times, in my opinion. You might disagree coming from combat situations. But I mean, that's not a massive issue. We need to be able to say that in a country of 350 million people. I mean, you're talking about if you take the full 100 figure and you view them all as unjustified, which probably isn't the case. I mean, you're talking about a 1 in 350,000 per patrol, per cycle for the officers chance of being killed if you're just a guy minding your own business. That's a tiny, tiny, infinitesimal chance. That's on par with being struck by lightning. So when people say we need to rip the system down, we need to institutionally dismantle policing. We saw Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib say some things like this. The closing line of her tweet was, "It's just not fixable." I mean, it's not even broken. I think that there's not a massive issue there. One of the things that I will say, having grown up in the hood, spent a lot of time, decent amount of time traveling, a lot of time in competitive business. I mean, you obviously were a military man. There's a tendency among people that haven't competed to assume that the default for things is utopia. This is that golden age bullshit. Like this is that Rousseau idea that like before we set up governments and militaries, people were these quote unquote noble savages living under trees, drinking ice cold water, eating acorn bread. And the reality is that we were naked savages hunting wild pigs with sharp sticks. I mean, it was like the camping trip from hell. You could never settle down. Warriors from the other tribe could jump out of the bush at any time, take all the women in your band. I mean, so this has never, ever been true, but it's still to this day, this golden age fantasy of before we developed, capitalism, whiteness, a sense of unified blackness, countries, flags, whatever BS thing, things were perfect. No, they weren't. They were worse. They were a lot worse. But it's that idea that when we look at something like an 8% rate of racism at the level of the work for, vote for question, like at the level of these classic measurements of bigotry, that means we've almost got the problem licked. It doesn't mean that we are too far away from the normal level of zero. Right. The normal level of racism for humans is probably 100%. Like everyone would be skeptical of the tribe over the hill that wears the color red instead of green if it weren't for our social conditioning and interracial dating and so on. So what's a figure for measured racism where we can relax maybe 5%? But to some extent, we're just making it up. Like 8% is not all that bad.
Much old for age. I mean, I would imagine as you get older, you become more tolerant and less worried about that kind of thing. I mean, maybe.
Well, actually, I think you become more racist as you get older. Like I think my understanding is you're more comfortable with the races you grew up with, which would be like whites and blacks. But if you look at maybe natives out west, but if you look at like the reaction of people toward mass immigration from other nuclear powers like India, I guarantee you like old white or black men are not more tolerant, like are not less likely to, do a voice and make fun of the new immigrants or something. And for me, all this is like, there's so much in this debate that's never discussed. Like a big problem for both the woke and the alt-right perspectives on a lot of this, for example, is that almost all Hispanic or South Asian immigrants are Caucasian. I mean, genetically, you're talking about like a 90% similarity to Central, if not Western Europeans. So when you say something like, look at these Hispanics struggling while we whites succeed, it's like, that's not a valid comment. You can't say something like whites do well, but Afghans don't. None of this is racial. None of this is genetic. The vast majority of this stuff, let's say, ties into questions of culture, background, tribe, so on. But I think when it comes to, just like one point, when it comes to moderating the effect of tribalism so that our cops no longer shoot every Irishman they see, or most people are willing to date interracially, I think we're doing pretty well.
The other thing is these categories that we seem to choose. One, we boil every problem down to a white or black problem when that's just completely unfair, especially in a nation with usually the second largest nation or a second largest population than other than the home nation in our country. And there's a lot of people here from a lot of different places. If you were to line up all Europe, like one European who's representative of that country, like everybody there is like that guy's Swedish, he's the guy going down the pipe. If we lined up all those folks, Albania, Georgia, whatever it's going to be, you wouldn't be able to pick where they were from, and they would look dramatically different. Eastern European folks, maybe it's a Jewish guy from Ukraine that comes out, it would be all completely different, and you would look and be like, there's no way I could judge all these people as the same thing. Same thing with the Hispanic world. We say Hispanic or people of color. How unfair to take away. You cannot put a Puerto Rican, a Mexican, and a Colombian together and say you're the same people. Like that is as bigoted a thing as you can do. It's completely intolerant and unfairly stereotyping. I thought we were getting past this stuff, but apparently we're not. So when we look at race, I mean, it always disappoints me when people go straight to race or, oh, this person is a black, this or whatever. What does black even mean? Ethiopians are black, Western Europeans are black, Sudanese people are black. And if you put them in the same situation, they're going to be people. They're not going to be just black, you know?
Yeah, now I will say that there's an interesting conversation here because I mean, talking to some of the genomics people for Taboo, I mean, there very definitely are human haplotype groups that we can logically call races. I mean, if you go to the 23andMe website, you'll see I think there are 56 regional populations that are very recognizable, like Slavs, that break down into 4 or 5 larger groups that differ maybe 2 or 3% in terms of those characteristics that vary with race at all. So, I mean, a larger group would be West Asian Caucasians, or what we think of as Arabs and Turks and the like. European Caucasians are whites. West African Bantu are actually about 85% of the blacks, if I have that correct, and so on down the line. So, I mean, it's certainly like you can say that someone is of West African Bantu descent, and I do think that's meaningful. The issue with a lot of this, so like when you say Mexicans, Colombians, and Puerto Ricans aren't the same people, that's actually an interesting and obvious point because, I mean, the average Mexican guy is mestizo, I mean, white and native. The average Colombian guy is just white, and the average Puerto Rican guy is black to some extent. I mean, 50% or so African descent. What's interesting, though, is that if you look at like Wikipedia's list of racial groups by household income, they all do almost identically in the USA. So again, that gets into the point that genes explain this pretty badly and levels of racism explain this pretty badly. You do see shared cultures that develop over periods of a century or two for different groups, like Hispanic American has been a pretty recognized thing since the 70s, if not the 20s. The question to some extent is how do you change the variables that input on those cultures to be wonky? Like, to me, the obvious cause of black and poor white fatherlessness is just welfare. I mean, like, it's considered a little simplistic when conservatives say that, but it's just obviously accurate. Like, you saw the rate of black illegitimacy go from 10% again to 23% during the Moynihan report to 72% today. And if you track that along with a graphic mapping welfare increases, they're identical. So, I mean, you even saw the stabilization of that at around 70% after Clinton and Gingrich reformed welfare and after we actually started policing again in the early 1990s. Now, I mean, you could argue that now that we're doing the reverse, it could go up again, but there's only so far you can go from like 70%, or for that matter, 40 or 50% for most of the white groups. So I don't know if we'll get that more epidemic. But yeah, things are pretty complicated. Definitely, I would agree. They're the just simplistic answers like, well, that's the black guys don't generally work out very well.
Those guys are lazy, just like the Mexicans. Like, good God.
Yeah. Except the Mexicans are technically all white. I mean, are all white and mestizo. That's, I mean, like, it really is. It's interesting, actually, to me as a social scientist, that a lot of this is so off the reservation comes to mind, but it is so forbidden as a research area that people don't really make these points. Like the fact that mestizo, black, and white Hispanics have pretty similar incomes would completely debunk a whole bunch of both very woke and kind of alty narratives, it would seem. This isn't the main thing I research, but like we know that's true. Like Mexicans and Puerto Ricans have the same income to within $2,000, 36 versus 38,000. So how is that, given that there is, far less racism against Caucasians or whatever? I mean, a lot of things have complex causes, and it would strike me that the number one variable there would probably be being in, a different country or territory speaking primarily Spanish. Like that's going to be difficult to get around if you're trying to get a job.
And what about like Asians? We struggle to understand even what Asians are. A friend of mine was talking about how they never saw Asians who looked like them in popular music, and I'm like, do you mean people like Paul Anka or Dick Dale who are Asian, of Asian descent because they're Lebanese? Or do you? He's like, no, they're not Asian. Like, okay, so they're from an Asian place, but they're not Asian. A fair conversation, but how do academics deal with that? Because I know that if you go to Europe and you say they're from the Orient, that means something different than it does here. You can't even say the damn word Orient, even though it just means East. And no one gets pissed off by saying Occidental. No one gets mad about that. And then when you talk about Asian, if you're in Sweden in school, or if you're in another country, these terms, they don't cross lines easily. They mean different things, different people. So when are you an Asian? When are you not an Asian? A white guy from Turkmenistan, and a black guy who says he's white from Turkey, and a guy from Argentina are all white. It's like, my head's gonna explode. How are we trying to categorize all these people as the same people? It's just impossible.
Well, I think if you're doing something like IQ research, I mean, the only useful way to do it is with the 23andMe categories. I mean,
Okay.
so like 80% of East Asians are probably what we would call Han, if not all of them. I mean, they're genetically Chinese, haplotypically Chinese. Again, I'm not a geneticist, so there might be some tiny differences. I mean,
Sure.
Thai people would probably have some like Malay inflow, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, when we talk about Asians, most people mean North Koreans, South Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, I mean, so on. The island populations down to the Philippines, Thailand, Taiwan, and almost all those people are Han. So when you say like there's a certain set of characteristics associated with Han culture, or like Han people, unless they eat a very high meat diet, tend to be a little smaller than whites or blacks. I mean, I think that's meaningful. Someone from Lebanon or Turkmenistan would be a West Asian Caucasian. So like we actually have a term for that. They're not Asian. The problem I think really comes up in that a lot of the census types who are just government mid-level bureaucrats, and certainly a lot of the Kendys and D'Angelos who maybe have, some interests in keeping all of this complicated, aren't necessarily really breaking this down at a genomics level. So obviously, if the category Asians includes people from Lebanon and people from Korea, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't on the census, yeah, that's pretty stupid. That doesn't mean though, so one thing about this, when people say race doesn't exist, probably the only thing I agree with the alt-right on, I mean, morally, I spent a fair amount of my career opposing these hard movements on black, left, white, right. But I mean, is that there obviously are human races. Like the 23andMe people and similar genomics testing companies almost got irritated enough to put together their service to some extent by a lot of the popular press narrative about how we're all identical people and these are just invented blocks we put people in. Not really. Like, it's completely fair to say East Africans are different from West Africans, which they do. But like, there's a very coherent group of people that are Black West Africans. Like Nigerians, Ghanaians, and so on tend to be, like, being a little glib here, but like tall, smart Black people with dark skin. I mean, like, there's a very obvious, like, it's very obvious that someone is from India or for, let's say, the subcontinent to most people that are observing that person communicate. Now, obviously, again, I think the smarts and all this are cultural, but the skin tone isn't. So, yeah, I mean, one sentence, if you put 100 Swedish guys, 100 guys from Nigeria, and 100 guys from Japan in a room naked, and you asked an anthropology student to come in and separate them on the basis of race, I could assume that almost anyone could do that, making virtually no mistakes at all.
What about, so we've been talking about your building up a business to work on anti-woke corporate culture, trying to sort these things out. And I'm big on the cultural thing. It's kind of how I stayed alive when I was overseas. And one of the things I see with someone like Kendi, to be unfair to pick him to represent a lot of people, but it's a lack of CQ. It's a lack of cultural acuity. They see one problem set, and Pete, the academic cultural guy, would say if you see incompetence or racism or these negative values, you have some incongruence in your cultural understanding of that person. if you spend time to understand how that group makes decisions and what their goals are, then you have a lot better chance to choose to be in the collaborative space. If you don't, because humans can get along across a lot of things. You can build trust in a lot of areas. We're more alike than we're not alike. Yes, West Africans tend to run faster at the extremities, you know, and yeah, maybe Eastern Africans run faster for longer at the super extremes. But for the most part, we're all about the same. And culture defines so much of us. Is this simply just an incapacity as someone who looks at race? Is that an inability to work culturally, and they lack the because we don't teach cultural acuity. The letters CQ are confusing to people. They don't know what it means, and we struggle to even have a definition of culture.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to some extent, obviously, we're not talking about race here. Now, I'll be just dead honest about this. I've already said I think there are essentially genetic races or haplotype groups, if you prefer. I don't think telling a Han guy from a West African guy would be difficult for anybody. And it's an entirely legitimate sector of research, whether there are small but real, for example, IQ or foot speed differences among groups. I tend to be very skeptical about the IQ stuff, considering where it started and considering the fact the whole world's gotten 20 points smarter over the past 40, 50 years. I mean, that to me debunks a lot of stuff. But I mean, the research on athleticism, I mean, we do find that almost all of the top 100 swimmers in the world are white, like at any given time. And I mean, you find that the large civilized white societies evolved literally around the Midworld Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. That is not a surprising finding. Whites also, by the way, seem to have, I don't know if this is supported in the genetics literature, but seem to hold almost all of the records for kind of spear chucking, like upper body strength and tossing ability. If you look at who the pitchers are, the quarterbacks are, the javelin throwers are. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, that's kind of what you would expect if one group ran a little slower than another. I mean, they'd have to get meat somehow. But moving from the theoretical to the real, I mean, of the top 100 sprinting times in the world, I think 98 are held by black guys, a couple white Britishers on there. And they're all black men of West African descent. I mean, Islanders, Jamaicans, Nigerians, Americans, Canadians. Again, the marathon times, the top 100, I mean, are majority, not all, but East African. You got a few Prefontaines in there, but I mean, it's mostly guys from Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, the Puntlands. So again, I think race obviously exists. There are some small differences, but the massive overriding impact of culture is clearly more important. I mean, going back to that figure about the mestizo guy, the white guy, and the black guy having the same income and speaking the same language, like that level of educational training and that linguistic background is going to impact you a lot more than any minuscule racial differences between them. Like they're all Hispanic, quote unquote, and they all make equal amounts of money. So clearly we're talking about culture. We're not talking about race in the real haplotypic sense. The idea of are we culturally poorly trained? I think I just went on with the longer section for the first part than I expected to, so keep this quick. But I do think that a lot of modern social scientists, especially on the left, tend to be pretty univariate, meaning they look at only one thing. So the almost a total explanation in modern sociology for black problems is racism. And when they move to poor white problems, they say classism. Okay, the obvious question there is why are there 400% differences in income between different white and black groups? Like all the different white groups are white and they all have the full range of social classes within them. But if you go from Jews to Appalachians, you're reducing average income by 75 or 78%. So why? Why do these white groups, who often look almost indistinguishable, say an Englishman from an Appalachian guy, differ so dramatically in terms of every variable you could imagine? And the reality is what we call culturalism. Like, what's the attitude in each regional group toward education? What's the amount of study time in each regional group? What's the degree of isolation for a hardworking but poor group like Cajuns? What's the degree of religion? Like, are they educating women to the same extent in the South as in the North? And I mean, when you adjust for those things, among people that are the same genetically, the gaps close. Not really sure how we got into this like race and genes thing, but I mean, you've done some writing in it. I'm definitely willing to talk about it.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, the more we learn about genes, and we're just on the tip of the iceberg with this thing. There's so much more to learn. We do learn things that like gender probably, like almost everything else, is on a spectrum. Sexual orientation probably is on a spectrum, and maybe not even a spectrum, maybe a matrix of some kind, three-dimensional. You can find yourself in a lot of areas. We started out with a binary thing, and primarily everybody's binary. Okay, great, but we're learning more about all of these things, and then what it takes to. I mean, if we can create, you know, gene splicing to create outcomes, then obviously people come with that naturally, whether they have a longer, slightly longer spine or whatever adaptation they've come to. I mean, Sherpas can go up and down mountains all day long. You know, I mean, that's what they do. They've adapted themselves to it. Is someone else trained to do it? Sure, but I think person for person, you're probably going to struggle to beat that population at that because they have adapted. And I mean, we can see that across a lot of different things. So I'm comfortable talking about genes and how much more of an impact they have on performance, at least again at the extremities, not the not not at in the middle where we all kind of gather. Anyhow, enough about all that stuff. What else do you want to talk about before we wrap it up?
I don't really have any other topics really close to mind. Obviously, the Chauvin trial's coming up, but we are coming to a close. We've already talked about police reform. What about you? Is there one more idea from your side?
Well, I've been reading Hate Crime Hoax again, and it
Good
just
call.
seems you're more and more accurate with what you wrote. It's just going more and more crazy. And again, if we're not going to hold people accountable, whether they're, we'll just call them rioters at all, if we're not going to hold those folks accountable, if we're not going to hold hate crime hoaxers accountable, um, how do we get better at this stuff? I mean, I used to say a couple of years ago, I was adorable. I used to say, no DA runs on I'm soft on crime. Apparently, that's a thing now. And that's going to cause a reaction. And I would like that reaction to stick within our rule of law structure and our ability to vote. But we don't appear to want to go that way. And by the way, it's just a soapbox thing. People always talk about wanting to vote and they want to increase access to voting, which I'm all for, but also the integrity of the election. When you get your jury summons, you don't get to complain about that. That is a right. You get to do that. You want to have the same thing happen for you if you go to court. We've got to get better in general. Voting is like the least you can do, to be a great citizen. So how do we make better citizens? How do we appreciate the incredible opportunities that we have? I mean, immigrants can come here. The guest today that I put up on the show today is a guy named Serge, and he's from Ukraine, and he's bounced around the world, and he got here. He helps people break out on social media with through content creation. This is like the ultimate immigrant story, and we have all of these things. Yet we have this belief that somehow we're anti-immigration, and we're just not. So, I guess it's just sort of like a mess of all of these things. But these perceptions continue to get worse, not better, and we seem to not want to hold ourselves accountable as a society, at least at a level that I understand.
I mean, that's a complex conversation there. I mean, so I guess a couple things there. So there are really two parts. What's going on with this current moment around crime, and how can we make better citizens? The current moment around crime, I don't see it lasting as long as. So first of all, I think that a terrible mistake is being made. One of the things that we know, one of the most robust findings in political science and criminal justice, is that when you give in to kind of mob will and you pull back solid integrated police departments, we're not talking about Bull Connor's troops here, crime goes up. And that's just sort of obvious common sense. Like, criminals aren't actually by and large all that stupid. If you're talking about fields like large scale drug dealing, murder for hire, shooters in the gang scene, and they respond to incentives, prostitutes. So if you arrest everyone that even breaks a window or sells sex in public, you're going to get a lot less crime. And if you stop arresting people that do things like carjack, which we're now having an epidemic of in Chicago, a lot of people released on I-bonds, you're going to get more crime. It's amazing to me that this is even controversial. So I actually looked up the national crime figures earlier today. Let's pull these up. I can do this in about 20 seconds. Okay.
While you do that, I'll tell everybody to go to the PayPal link and support the Break It Down show. It's right there on the page. You can also get Will Reilly's book, Hate Crime Hoax. I'm reading it again now. It's on Audible. Take that link that's in the show notes there and grab that. And also don't forget to get 10 facts you can't talk about. Taboo, 10 facts you can't talk about. Also from Will Reilly. He is fantastic.
Boom. Thank you, Pete. So, in terms of what I was talking about here, if you look for the graphic United States crime rates 1960 to 2019, which is up at disastercenter.com, very serious disaster response site, the total number of murders between 1963, which is when we really started relaxing anti-crime protocols during the 1960s. You're talking about Miranda, Escobedo, fruit of the poison tree, maximum sentences, so on down the line. The number of murders between 1963 and 1993 jumped from 8,640 in 1963 to 24,530 in 1993. I mean, an even more disgusting crime, the number of rapes. And this is during the 60s sexual revolution at the starting point. So it's probably pretty high reporting through all of this. But the number of rapes jumped from 17,650 to 106,010.
Wow.
Robberies, let's see here, jumped from 116,000 to 1,135,600. No, that's aggravated assaults. Robberies alone out of that category jumped to 659,870. There's also a massive increase in ag assaults. So anyway, I mean, I think that's what happens when you take, by this point, good professional police departments, a lot of ex-service members, very few actual racists, 25, 30% black, and you pull them out of poor neighborhoods. This includes poor white neighborhoods. You see a surge in crime. So, I mean, there was a study recently that was presented as police shootings drop following Black Lives Matter protests in a group of major cities. And they did find that. They found that police homicides, justified or not, by the way, dropped by about 300 across this set of cities over a couple of years if the city had a Black Lives Matter protest. There was another line that, although the authors are good and honorable, was kind of buried deep in the paper. And that was that murders, just regular ass murders, rose by 6,000 in the same cities. And that's almost exactly the murder surge we saw last year, which was by about 5,000 murders. So, I mean, I think when you get these DAs coming in there and saying we're going to do the next generation of criminal justice reform, because we already have Miranda rights, we already have the Escobedo extension, we already have fruit of the poison tree, we already have the sentencing grid. The next lineup of things is going to be releasing people without bail, releasing people on I bonds. I mean, it's going to be non-prosecution for certain crimes. What you're going to see is just crime going back to, if this is allowed to continue, 1970s levels. The only thing that kind of gives me hope here, other than all my guns and banter aside, but is that I don't think people are going to put up with this as long. I mean, you now have the great heterodox news sources like Quillette just live on the internet. I mean, you now have pictures of, you know, each crime that are circulating through, I mean, the sites on the right, like Conservative Treehouse, the Black Stuff, MTO. I mean, people are going to be aware of what's going on. And you're going to have a lot of guys, white, black, whatever, just saying, I'm not really all that sympathetic to these felons that are shot by cops, you know, in these private internet discussions. So I don't think we're going to do another 30 years of lawlessness, but we might do 10. You know, and how many black guys or working class white guys would be killed during that 10 years because of these ideas? Now, the deeper question, how can we be better citizens? That's hard to answer. I think one start would be just learning to look at the truth. You know, questioning the media, seeking out real information in the library, and so on down the line. I can't imagine that having a bad result. But that, which I always encourage people to do when I talk, is one of the best ways to counter some of the nonsense that we've been describing. How do you know there aren't 10,000 people a year killed by the police? Because you read.
Yeah, and you need to know how to do research methods, and you learn what BS looks like. Well, listen, it's Friday. I don't want to work you any harder than this. You've been awesome. I always love having you on and having these rangy conversations. I hope everybody else can appreciate that for sure. Go support Will. Look, if you get Hate Crime Hoax, you're going to love that book. It's on Audible. That's how I listen to it when I'm rowing. You can get that there. And then again, Taboo, which there's so many things in these books that you just want to, like, I want to know more about this. I want to know more about that. It's really great. I'm glad that you got the new book about to come out and the one following that. Everybody support Will. And he's not hard to find on social media. So if you want to yell at him and tell him he's wrong, you can always go on Twitter, Facebook, and all those places. All right. Stand by 1 sec, Will.
All right.
Hey,
Sounds
thanks for
good.
watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much